Well, it's wonderful to see you all this evening. Let me add my welcome to James. I'm also James. Everybody here is called James, not everyone. And I think there are a few newcomers this evening, so it's lovely to see you as well. It'd be nice to catch up with you and say hello after the service if you can stick around. We're about to continue our series in the book of Ruth, but before we dive into chapter 2, let me start with the question: is God really that good? Is God really that good? We were just singing, "The God of mercy hears our plea," weren't we? But does he? Or does he always? And this is one of the great questions that people have asked down the ages. There are obviously different versions of the same question. So is God good when there is suffering and evil out there in the world? I think probably more people are asking that question this weekend. Or what about, is God good when my own personal life turns sour? Or then maybe the more practical version of the same question: what would God's goodness, if he was good to me, really feel like? You know, if I ask him for help, how would I know if he's actually answered that prayer or not? Well, those are certainly questions that our characters in the book of Ruth would have been asking where we left them off last week as we finished chapter 1. So we're working through this brilliant, true story from the Old Testament, a story that took place in the time of the Judges, a time when chaos seemed to reign, and we can relate to that. Chaos certainly seemed to be reigning in Ruth and Naomi's personal lives, two of the main characters in this story. So if you remember, I'll do a quick recap for us before we read chapter 2. Ruth and Naomi, they've just returned to Naomi's old home, which is Bethlehem. You might have heard of Bethlehem, same place. They've been over the border in a neighbouring country of Moab for the last 10 years, as in Moab, Israel's historic enemies, Moab who worshipped false gods. And things have not gone well over in Moab. So Naomi's husband and her 2 sons died. And so Naomi decided to come home to Bethlehem, and one of her daughters-in-law stayed in Moab, but the other one, Ruth, clung to Naomi. And chapter 1 ended with them arriving back in Bethlehem, Naomi feeling pretty bitter and miserable, if we're honest. And maybe just imagine that first night back home in Bethlehem, how Naomi and Ruth respectively might have been feeling. So Naomi, she's still devastated from her loss, but I think probably also still feeling the embarrassment and the awkwardness of having had to come home again, almost with her tail between her legs. She'll be so conscious, you could imagine, of all the gossip that's probably flying around the village right now about her. And she's got Ruth with her, which to some extent would have been a comfort. But also, I wonder if Naomi is kind of wishing Ruth wasn't there, because this Moabite woman must have just been a constant reminder of the mistakes that Naomi has made in the past. And this is another mouth to feed, and Naomi doesn't have any food or money. So that's Naomi. And then there's Ruth. How is Ruth feeling? Well, she's probably feeling very uncertain at this point. I've committed myself to Naomi and to her God. Was that the right call? She's probably aware, she must be aware, that the God of Israel has a reputation of being good, of being a provider for his people. But will he come good for her, a foreigner? And if so, how will that happen? Shall we see? Let's get into our reading. Let me invite up our 4 readers again. We're going to continue with the dramatic readings because it's such a dramatic book. So let's welcome them up. And you might want to stick up a hand if you need a Bible as it's passed around by Amelia.
Awesome. So we're going to be reading from Ruth chapter 2, which can be found on page 267 in the church Bibles. So that's Ruth chapter 2 on page 267 in the church Bibles. Now, Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi,
"Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favour."
"Go ahead, my daughter."
So she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz. who was from the clan of Elimelech. Just then, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters.
"The Lord be with you."
"The Lord bless you," they answered. Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters,
"Who does that young woman belong to?"
The overseer replied, "She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi." She said, "Please, let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters." She came into the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. So Boaz said to Ruth,
"My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled."
At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She asked him,
Why have I found such favour in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?
"I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wing you have come to take refuge."
May I continue to find favour in your eyes, my lord. You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants.
At mealtime, Boaz said to her,
"Come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar."
When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men.
"Let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her."
So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. Her mother-in-law asked her,
"Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you."
Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working.
The name of the man I work with today is Boaz.
"The Lord bless him. He's not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. That man is our close relative. He's one of our guardian redeemers."
He even said to me, "Stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain."
"It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed."
So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law.
Thank you guys for reading so well. So, let's dive into this wonderful chapter and see what is in store. So verse 1, keep the Bible open, don't close it, we're going to be tracking along fairly closely with the narrative. So verse 1, as readers here, we're told something that Ruth doesn't know yet. She's only going to discover later. There's a man who lives in Bethlehem who is a man of standing, or wealthy, that could be translated, and he's from the clan of Elimelech. Now that is quite interesting information for us to be given as readers. I wonder if that might turn out to be relevant later in the story. We'll see. Anyway, the story really gets going in verse 2, and a fateful day is dawning in the town of Bethlehem. Act 1, the act in which we will see that God provides. So it's early morning. Ruth and Naomi, they're sat there having breakfast, you could imagine, which is probably just hot water because they haven't got food. And I imagine they're probably not really talking very much. There's an awkward silence. Maybe Naomi is giving Ruth the silent treatment. But then verse 2, Ruth breaks the silence. Okay, well here's an idea, Naomi. In Moab, we heard about this law that you guys have in Israel, where the foreigners or the poor people can gather wheat, just leftover grain at harvest time, is that right? And Ruth is right. So this is one of God's laws. It's in Leviticus 19. It says this: when you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap the very edges of your field, or gather gleanings of your harvest. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. And just, what a great law, right? It's really compassionate. So Ruth says, Naomi, we've been here, maybe a few days now. We've just been scrounging food off our neighbours. But how about I try that, the gleaning thing, today? Maybe I'll get us enough dinner for tonight. Naomi shrugs. All right, go ahead. See what happens. Now, just to point out, when Ruth heads out to the fields to glean, she is really vulnerable. So the harvesting is a predominantly male, working, manual labour environment, and Ruth is a young woman on her own. Now, at the best of times, that would probably be quite intimidating. How am I going to be looked at? Are there going to be comments? Are there going to be wolf whistles or worse? But here, it's especially bad because this is the time of the judges, remember? When chaos reigns. And the sorts of things that happen to women in this time do not bear repeating. If you especially read the last few chapters of the book of Judges, it is a pretty sickening read, honestly, if you read it. And a lot of it takes place, actually, here in Bethlehem. Don't know if you knew that. This is the place where Ruth is now venturing out towards the working men on her own. Now, she's doing the right thing. It is the only sensible option for her, but it is seriously brave. So she arrives out at the fields in verse 3. She picks one, presumably just at random, and she gets out her bag and starts picking up the stalks of grain that have just been left behind by the harvesters. She's probably just minding her own business. She must have been very nervous. But then the narrator adds a comment again, and I just love the phrasing at the end of verse 3. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to a certain Boaz. So Ruth just so happened to choose that field. And we're like, did she now? Okay. The field of a man who's really wealthy, and a relative, and who's actually going to turn out to be just really, really kind and generous on top of that. What a coincidence. What are the chances? Obviously, it's not a coincidence at all, is it? It's super clear. This is the providence of God. This is God's precise control, his careful direction, his good sovereignty. He's directing Ruth to exactly the right place at exactly the right time. There are no coincidences. God is orchestrating everything in order to provide just what Ruth needs. Isn't that brilliant? And this is something that is always true of God, if we just pause on that. It's so good that we're looking at the story of Ruth now, hot on the heels of our mid-year conference a couple of weekends ago, where so many of us were thinking about this very subject, God's sovereignty. The story of Ruth is teaching us that in God's providence, he provides for us. He provides for his people. Even if you can't always see how at the time. The reason I particularly love that phrase in verse 3, as it turned out, is because for God there is no as it turned out. Or actually literally in the Hebrew it says as chance chanced. For God there is no chance. There is no just so happened. There is no as luck would have it. There are no coincidences. He is orchestrating everything, and he does that in order to provide just what his people, what we need. And that is just so wonderfully reassuring. Okay, that's Act 1. Act 2. God provides through his people. We're back in the barley field. It's now mid-morning. It's fairly hot, you could imagine. Ruth is working away, head down. She's still just gleaning, probably off at the far corner of the field, away from the other people. And on the other side, who should arrive but the owner of the field, Boaz. And I really like the first words that we hear out of his mouth. So you remember this is a predominantly male manual labour environment, so what would you expect to be the normal way of saying hi in the morning in that kind of environment? At best, probably, all right lads, at best. At worst, probably, well, more commonly I reckon, probably just the sort of non-verbal nod and grunt. At worst though, especially in the days of the judges, in Bethlehem, I reckon maybe you might expect a bit of banter about last night's exploits. Boys, you'll never guess what happened after we left last night. But not Boaz. Verse 4, what does he say? The Lord be with you. Lord, as in God's personal name, Yahweh, the God of Israel, be with you. This is a godly man. And the culture that is cultivated with his workers, they respond in kind. The Lord bless you. And actually, like so many of the prayers in this book, this little prayer, little do they know how much God will indeed bless Boaz. So anyway, Boaz he's just arrived, he's sipping his morning coffee, he's starting to inspect the work in the field, and he spots this unknown woman off in the distance, gleaning. Chaps, who's that? Who's that lady? And the foreman's like, oh, it's that Moabite woman, you remember? The one who arrived with Naomi? She's just gleaning, she's no trouble. Actually, she's been working really hard all morning. She hasn't really stopped except for one tiny break. So Boaz starts making his way around the field towards Ruth. Now if you just imagine you're Ruth in that moment, and you notice the man who is clearly in charge coming towards you. He's heading your way, he's obviously a rich man, he's obviously important, and he's coming your way. You don't know what he wants. Again, just imagine how daunting that must have been for her, as a newcomer, a foreigner from an enemy nation, a young woman out here in the fields on her own. And so then imagine how she must have felt when Boaz opens his mouth and says, verse 8, my daughter. Isn't that such a kind way to put her at ease? And then he basically says, please stay in my field. You're safe here. Verse 9, I've told the men not to lay a hand on you, which, the fact that he has to say that is a sign of the times, right? People might try to lay hands, but Boaz's field is obviously something of an oasis of safety. This is a godly man who fosters a godly culture. And he's like, help yourself to the water whenever you like. You're really welcome here. And Ruth is just astonished. Verse 10, Boaz, why are you being so kind to me? I'm just a girl from Moab. And it's true, he's treating her as though she's an Israelite. And he explains why. Verse 11, well, the reason is actually, I do know who you are. And I know how kind you've been to Naomi. How you've committed yourself to her and to our people. I think basically he's really impressed with her. And in particular with her commitment to Naomi and to the Israelite people. And he seems to understand what it was that all Israelites were supposed to understand, which is that Gentiles, non-Israelites, they're only a problem if they're worshipping false gods. But if they commit themselves to Yahweh, the one true God, they are so welcome. Boaz gets that, and that is why he's not treating Ruth like a foreigner. She's so welcome. And that's the vibe of his prayer for you. Like, this is so lovely. Did you see he prays for her in verse 12? His prayer for her. He says in verse 12, may the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. What a powerful image that last bit is. It's like the Lord is this colossal eagle, covering anybody who runs to him for refuge with his strong and protective wings. But the substance of his prayer is essentially, may God treat you right. May he look after you and bless you now that you have come to him. And as we'll see again, the Lord will answer that prayer abundantly. And interestingly, it's going to be Boaz who turns out to be the answer to that prayer. And more on that to come. But again, Ruth's reaction to all of this in verse 13, she's just blown away. Of course she is. Thank you for taking notice of me. Thank you for being so kind and so welcoming. So remember those questions I mentioned a few minutes ago at the start? What does God's goodness really feel like? How do I know if he's looking out for me? Well, how is it that God shows his kindness and goodness to Ruth? How does he welcome her? So the grain, it doesn't just miraculously appear on Ruth's doorstep, although God could do that. Her protection is not from an army of angels, although God could do that. She's not welcomed into God's people with writing in the sky or a voice from the clouds or something, although God could do that. Actually, God does all those things, the provision, the protection, the welcome, through his people. In this case, through one person, through Boaz. Isn't that interesting? God works out his sovereign good purposes by using us. God provides through his people. Just think, have you ever been treated really kindly by a Christian? Maybe in an unexpected way, just really treated. Can you think of a time? I can think of like so many times for me. Times when people have listened to me more than I expect to be listened to. Times when people have blessed me with food. Maybe some of you have been blessed this afternoon at Connect Clusters with food. Times when people have acted like my big brother, or like my mum or my dad, when I've needed support or protection. Do you know what? Even times when people have given me cash when I've needed it. That has happened. There was one time at Bible college when we were a bit strapped for cash, and we were praying about it, and I show up to my pigeonhole, and there's an envelope with £100 in it. And to this day, I don't know who it's from, but amazing kindness, right? And so I just want us to kind of join the dots here. When a Christian brother or sister treats you kindly, that is God treating you kindly through them. I would really like to be better at noticing that sort of thing and seeing life through that lens a bit more. Maybe it would change the way that I pray. Thank you, Lord, for showing me your kindness through that person. Maybe it would change the way I thank my brothers and sisters for their kindness. Thank you so much, and I thank the Lord for being kind to me through you. Isn't it a blessing to be a Christian? And if you're not a Christian, maybe this is one of the things that has actually attracted you towards Christianity. Just how nice Christians are. That is often the way it works. And I hope you've seen that. I hope you've seen Christians being kind. But have you joined the dots? The reason Christians are so kind, a lot of the time, is that God is kind. And he's using his people to enact his kindness. I guess for those of us who are believers, this is then an encouragement for us to keep on enacting God's kindness, isn't it? Reading this chapter, I'm really struck by that oasis of safety thing. You know, how welcoming and safe and protective Boaz has made his field, so that Ruth feels okay being there in a world where chaos reigns. Wouldn't it be great if Christchurch Southampton became known as an oasis of safety? Like, I think in many ways it is that already, but all the more. And for it to grow, for it to stay like that and to grow like that, what do we need to do? I think probably we all need to be on the lookout for the Ruths among us, if I can put it that way. As in, maybe that's newcomers to church. Orlando has this phrase, a newcomer on their own is an emergency. Some of you might have heard that before. Let's be on the lookout. Or let's look out for people who are struggling. Ruth was struggling. So perhaps in your small group, your Connect group, somebody just alludes to something that sounds quite tough. Could you be the one who sends a follow-up message a bit later? An oasis of safety. Whoever it is, let's get really good at spotting those who are struggling, those who are on the outside, and welcoming them, listening to them, standing up for them, making it clear that they are so welcome. We can enact God's goodness in their lives. Back to the story. Act 3. God provides more than we need. More than we need. So this is verse 14. We're now at lunchtime. Ruth is still working and she hears a shout. It's Boaz. Hey, we're having lunch. Do you want to join us? And with this, Boaz, at this point, has gone a long way beyond the letter of the law. That law in Leviticus 19. He's now being proactively kind to Ruth. So Ruth, she goes over, she joins Boaz, and he's like, here, have some of my bread. Feel free to use my tasty dip as well. I think wine vinegar was probably a bit of a delicacy in those days. And he gives her a whole load of roasted grain as well. Remember, Ruth has not eaten much, and she's been working hard in the sun all morning. This is probably a delicious meal. The best meal I've ever had was midway through a cycle ride with some friends from London to Oxford, which is about 80 miles. And we probably done about 50 miles in the morning, hadn't eaten or stopped. I was famished. We stopped by the side of the road, just ate whatever we had in our rucksacks. For me, it was half a baguette that was quite sort of stale, and some very warmed up cheese, and some kind of shriveled tomatoes, and it's the best meal I've ever eaten. It's just delicious. Ruth is having that kind of moment now. Best meal of her life. All because of Boaz's kindness. And Boaz is above and beyond kindness. It just carries on. So verse 15, he tells the men, guys, let her gather among the actual sheaves of wheat this afternoon, not just the kind of standalone ears of grain. And verse 16, he goes even further. I think he's kind of whispering to his workers now, actually, boys, when she's not looking, Can a few of you just pull out a few cheeky extra stalks and leave them for her to pick up? Just, I want her to have loads of food tonight. It's just so generous. Let me ask you something. Doesn't Boaz remind you of somebody else? A bit later in the Bible story? Another man who, when he saw people who were hungry, he just couldn't help giving them food. So much food, they had all they wanted and had some left over, quote. Another man who took a particular interest in poor people and the vulnerable and the weak and made sure they knew they were so welcome. Another man who was also from the little town of Bethlehem. Jesus is the greater and better Boaz, isn't he? Little technical aside here. What I've just done there, drawing the line to Jesus from Boaz, is what people sometimes call typology, the Bible scholars. So typology, that means when you're reading the Old Testament, you will often find types or shadows of New Testament realities. So it could be an Old Testament object like the temple, which foreshadows things like the Holy Spirit living in us as Christians. Or it could be an Old Testament storyline like the Exodus rescue that foreshadows the bigger and better gospel rescue. Or it could be a person like Boaz foreshadowing Jesus himself. This is one of the big ways that the New Testament expects us to read the Old Testament. And the reason we have these types in the Old Testament is because they help us to understand and appreciate more what it is that we actually have in the gospel, in the New Testament as Christians. And I really like the example we have here in Ruth with Boaz, because doesn't seeing what Boaz is like just massively increase your appreciation for Jesus? So as in Boaz, he seems like such a great guy, doesn't he? Like, wouldn't you have so loved to have been Ruth, meeting him and being so blessed by that? Wouldn't you have just loved to be like one of Boaz's workers in the fields? Like, even just to hang out with a guy as generous as that, someone who gives food to the poor and keeps vulnerable women safe. That would have been great to know him. But then you look at Jesus. He has compassion on the crowds and feeds literally thousands of people. Twice, 2 occasions. Like, how much greater is Jesus? How much more do you want to hang out with him? And you will get to, for all eternity. Back to the story for the final act. Act 4. God provides out of his Hesed love. The God of Hesed love. So verse 17, it's now the evening, and Ruth, she's come in from the field, and she's in the barn, threshing the barley she's gleaned. That means she's getting the actual grains of wheat out from the stalk. It's quite a long process. When she's done, it turns out she has bagged a whole ephah of grain. So how much is an ephah? Well, it's about 13 kilograms of grain. That's a lot. At our Connect Cluster meal this afternoon, we had baked potatoes, and we were feeding enough for like 25 people, and that was 10 kilograms of potatoes. So Ruth's got more than that of grain. It's a lot of grain, incredible amount. Remember, she came out this morning hoping for maybe enough for one meal. This is like 2 weeks' worth. Verse 18, she takes it back to town. I bet it was quite hard to even carry all of that. And it just underlines how generous Boaz has been. He's gone way over the top. And when Ruth gets back home, Naomi immediately understands that. So Ruth staggers in through the door, this massive sack of grain. Naomi's like, Ruth, what? How? Where have you been? Who was so kind? And Ruth explains what's happened, and she's like, it's all because of this man Boaz. Have you heard of Boaz? And then for Naomi, it just all seems to click into place. Look at verse 20. The Lord bless him. And that is a very different attitude to what we've seen in Naomi so far. She's suddenly feeling generous. The Lord bless him. Funny how Boaz's generosity seems to breed generosity in other people, isn't it? And then she goes on, he has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. Now that word kindness, that's been translated kindness, the Hebrew word behind that is a word that's pronounced chesed, with a kind of but chesed. It's actually quite a theologically loaded word. There's no direct equivalent in English. It's kindness, it's love, it's loyalty. So, those of you who know your Bibles, do you remember the golden calf incident? This is Israel's spiritual adultery right after they've just kind of committed themselves to following God, a bit like in a marriage, and they commit spiritual adultery, worshipping a golden calf. Inexplicably, straight after that, God chooses to forgive them Why does he do that? Well, to quote God, it's because he is the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in hesed. Hesed means kindness that is over the top. Loyalty, even when there's been betrayal. Love that goes beyond the call of duty. Now, when Naomi says in verse 20, he has not stopped showing his hesed, who is the he? Is it Boaz or is it God? I'm actually not sure. It could be either. But either way, this is an amazing statement on the lips of Naomi because she's changed so much in her attitude, like I said. So what did she say last week in chapter 1? She said, the Lord's hand has turned against me. The Almighty has made my life very bitter. But now, it's like she's reinterpreting everything. It's almost like she's thinking, well, maybe God has been kind all along. And she even begins to show signs of hope for the future. So end of verse 20, she locks onto the significance of Boaz being a relative. She's like, oh, hang on, that's Elimelech's cousin. Wait a second. He could be a guardian redeemer for us. Now, we'll get on to the guardian redeemer thing in a lot more detail next week. Long story short, though, for now, the guardian or kinsman redeemer, it's another Old Testament law where God's people are told to help out their relatives who've fallen on hard times, particularly financially, like you're supposed to bail them out, basically. But Naomi seems to have had something more than just financial help in mind. She's suddenly looking at Ruth in a whole new way. She's like, you're single. Boaz is single. I wonder. So verse 22, she says, Ruth, you've got to stick with Boaz. Like, as if Ruth needs convincing, but we're left wondering if maybe there might be some romance in the air soon. You'll have to come back next week to find out. And so ends the final act of this momentous day in the lives of Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz. We began with the question, is God good? Is he really that good? I think our answer, if we're honest, very often just fluctuates. It changes, like it did for Naomi. 1 minute we're bitter. We can't see God's goodness because of our circumstances. And then next minute, reinterpret everything. Our jaded world weariness is suddenly replaced by the bright eyes of faith. And that is really understandable. Like, isn't it so normal if you're having a tough time just to check out slightly from your walk with the Lord? Maybe you fade out of church life a bit. We let our Bibles gather dust. We forget to pray, particularly if the tough time goes on for a while. It's very normal. And then as soon as the tough times end, the sun comes out in our life and we suddenly find we're back in church, we're praising God, our prayer life is firing again, we feel full of faith. And that's very normal. I've experienced that. We all have. But wouldn't it be better if we just trusted God all along? To be constant in our walk with him, even before things get better. Oh, that we would be more faithful and more constant than Naomi was. Oh, that we would see our world not through the jaded eyes of world weariness, but with the bright eyes of faith. And remember, as we end, we do have one massive advantage over Naomi. Because she ends this fateful day thinking, maybe Boaz could be our redeemer. Maybe he can rescue us from our poverty and instability and shame. Maybe. But for us, there's no maybe. Much more on this next week, but we do have a redeemer. And it's the greater and better Boaz. It's Jesus Christ. He has rescued us from all our shame, all our uncertainty. He has given us untold riches. He has made us so welcome in the family of God. He's done that through his death on the cross and his resurrection. It has happened. Is God really that good? We know that he is. He's our redeemer. He's our provider. He abounds in hesed love. He goes the extra mile to provide for us, loyalty beyond the call of duty. And more often than not, he shows us that love and kindness through each other, through his people. I'm going to pause there before we head into a time of questions, reflections and comments. I'm going to give us just 20 seconds on our own to ponder anything that's particularly struck you. Okay, why don't we take a moment just in pairs where we're sat, chat about anything that has particularly resonated for you, and chat about if you've got any questions. I would love to hear either things that have resonated or questions when we come back together in 1 minute's time. Over to you. All right, let me interrupt there. Any questions from anybody, or just any reflections, things that resonated for you? Either is very, very welcome.
Yeah. So I guess with Naomi's attitude of recognising like God's amazing generosity, I guess that's fairly easy to do in a not chapter 2 situation where you can really evidently see God's generosity. I guess the question is, how can we have this attitude in a chapter 1 situation, like so that we always recognise God's generosity, not just when times are good.
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it? That is the right question. I think 2 things. No idea. No, 2 things spring to mind. Number 1, Naomi could look back, so we can look back to the cross, a firm anchor in history that tells us God has been generous to us and he always will be. He does love us. Naomi had something similar. She could have looked back to the Exodus, where God does something very, very similar, rescuing his people, going above and beyond. So she could have done that. The other thing is, she always had Ruth with her, and she never seemed in chapter 1 to appreciate that. And I just think God does show us his kindness predominantly through people, and Naomi she missed it. And you can understand why she missed it. She's devastated by loss, and she's feeling shame and all sorts of things. But, I mean, if you hear last week, we said she says, I came back empty when she arrives back in Bethlehem. But then in chapter 4, the other women in the village will say, Ruth is worth more to you than 7 sons. So she's not empty at all, and she never had been. Thanks, David. It's a good question. Anybody else?
Thanks so much, James. I really love the point that the kindness that we receive from God's people, we can draw that line to then God's kindness. But I definitely have been with people who've experienced real hurt from Christians that should be different to that. And just wondered, what line should we draw then in that situation?
Yeah, thank you. And that is a terrible thing when that happens. And I think the reason it's so terrible, it's horrible when somebody is mean to you or nasty to you or does awful things to you. Whenever that happens, and it's particularly painful when it's someone who says that they are a Christian or purports to be a Christian, precisely because we know that they shouldn't be like that. And I think that's why it hurts twice as much, and some of us may have had that experience, that kind of hurt, or maybe do now. And what can you do with that? I think you have to recognise that's not how it's supposed to be. And for our part, it can be our job to be more like Boaz, I think, and create the oasis of safety wherever we're able to and have some influence. But I would say if you're somebody who wants to talk through something that's happened to you, maybe there's something particularly significant and you suffered at the hands of somebody in a church sphere, then do talk to somebody. It really shouldn't have happened, and we want to talk it through and pray with you and help you process it. So thanks, Dave. One more at the front.
A sort of add-on thing that I noticed in your talk about Boaz is that part of the thing that made him so good was his adherence to God's law. So it's that he's God's people under God's law, and I've been reflecting on this for all sorts of reasons, but the fact that God's laws, we can often think, it's so great to live in the New Testament era where Christ has completed the law for us, and that's absolutely true. But even recognising even that as God's generosity is just really encouraging.
Amen. Thanks, James.